So we're going to be talking about stuff that can involve the old today, although my bio talked about a lot of the stuff I've done at the beginning of life on abortion. As you know, with the theme for today's conference, I'm going to be talking about the topic of assisted suicide and euthanasia. And I wanted to begin by telling you a story. And the story I want to tell you involves two young men. These young men have never met each other, and yet they have a number of things in common. The guy on the left, his name is Dan, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank on his name, Dan James. And on the right is Matt Hampson. So Dan and Matt, as I said, have never met each other, but here are what they have in common. The first is that they're both from England. Right, so I like to say that means they've got a fantastic accent. I love speaking in accents. I would love to give this whole presentation in an accent, but you know it's not real. So the second thing they have in common is that being from England, their parents placed both the young boys in rugby at a young age. And the next thing they have in common is that both Dan and Matt excelled at their rugby playing. The next thing they have in common, interestingly, because again, they never met each other, is both of them, when they were in their early 20s, while at a scrumming practice, there was an accident in each situation, and both of them became paralyzed. Dan became paralyzed from the chest down, and Matt became paralyzed from the neck down, and so he requires the use of a ventilator. That's what they have in common, but there is a striking difference today, and that is that Dan is dead and Matt is thriving. Dan, in the face of his paralysis, decided he did not want to continue living, and so he traveled to Switzerland, where he went to a euthanasia clinic and returned to England as a corpse. Matt, on the other hand, the one whose paralysis was more severe from the neck down, Matt is thriving, as I mentioned. He volunteers with children. He raises money for spinal cord research. He's a writer. He's a motivational speaker. Both of these men have a very similar, or had a very similar experience, and yet a strikingly different response. So what determines whether someone goes the path of Dan or the path of Matt? Well, I would say the answer to that question can be seen when reflecting on the insights and the philosophy of one of my favorite authors, a man by the name of Viktor Frankl. How many of you have heard of the book called Man's Search for Meaning? Okay, actually a fair amount of people. That's awesome. Maybe you had to read it for school, not sure. But I highly recommend it for those of you who haven't read it. And Man's Search for Meaning was written by this psychiatrist, Dr. Viktor Frankl, who wrote about his experiences in the concentration camps in the Second World War, where he was sent to Auschwitz amongst several other camps, as well as writing about his theories in psychology and how to help people who are suffering and going through a difficult time in life. And Dr. Frankl came up with the following mathematical equation, which I think provides insight into understanding Dan versus Matt in the face of their shared experience. Dr. Frankl said D equals S minus M, and what he meant by that is this: despair is suffering without meaning. Despair is suffering without meaning. The idea being that if you are despairing, you could be on the verge of suicide like Dan was. But Matt never chose that path, and yet both of them have in common S. And the reality is all of us have that letter in common, because suffering is part of the human experience. It has been a part of our life, and it will continue to be a part of your life. Even if you're in a good place right now, I have some bad news for you. At some point in the future, you're going to suffer. But whether you despair in light of the suffering that you have faced or will face is entirely dependent on the M. Can you find meaning in your suffering? And so Dr. Frankl's whole point is that to the extent that we find a lot of meaning and that number goes up, the D, despair, goes down. But if we find little to no meaning and that number is super low for meaning, then that D, that despair, is going to go up. Dr. Frankl cites an example of a young teenager several decades ago from this state, actually from Texas. She was in a car accident, and like Dan and Matt, she also became paralyzed. She was a quadriplegic. And Dr. Frankl said, let me tell you how she spends her days. She watches the news. She reads the news. She listens to the news. And whenever she comes across a story of someone who's going through a difficult time, of some crisis in the world, some hardship that someone is facing. Whenever she encounters a story like that, she calls for an assistant to come to her. And she asks that assistant to place a little stick in her mouth. And then she uses that stick to pound out letters on a keyboard in order to write notes of encouragement to people that she read about in the news. And Dr. Frankl remarked, that young woman lives a life of profound meaning, of great purpose and fulfillment. She won't despair, even though she's suffering, because she's found meaning. And when it comes to the topic of assisted suicide and euthanasia, the challenge we face as pro-lifers is to convince the culture and those who are in moments of suffering that if they can find meaning, then it's possible to not despair. It's possible to choose the path of Matt rather than the path of Dan. So what I want to do this morning is 3 things. The first thing I want to do is share with you more stories like the one that I just shared, through which the story will identify a core principle that I think should guide our thinking when it comes to the topic of assisted suicide and euthanasia. So the story to identify the principle that we can use to communicate to others. The second thing I want us to do is put our feet in the shoes of someone who doesn't think like us. I want us to consider and reflect on the reasons someone would provide for favoring assisted suicide. And then I want us to illuminate the alternative response. And I'm going to end with just some practicals of what we can do with this information. And as was mentioned, if questions arise in your mind as I'm going along, submit those on the app, and we're going to have an opportunity for some Q&A as well. So the first thing then is to continue on with stories that identify core principles that should guide our thinking. And the next story I want to tell you is of this young woman by the name of Zhu Li. Zhu Li, as you can tell in this image, does not have legs and has only about a half of her arms. Zhu Li was born this way, and Zhu Li has faced a lot of challenges, crises, suffering, and traumas in her life beyond the physical disfigurement that she was born with. When Zhu Li was 2 years old, her father committed suicide. When she was 7 years old, she was raped. Throughout her childhood, Zhu Li was bullied, so that by the time she was 15, she thought about committing suicide. Thankfully, Zhu Li did not act on that inclination, and thankfully, her greatest ally, her biggest advocate and support has been her mother. And her mother raised her to believe that no matter what suffering she had faced or would face, that she could overcome it, that she could rise above it, that she should never give up. And that even though she was physically different, she could still accomplish great things. If you Google her, you can come across the incredible painting and artwork that she has created. You can also see video footage, ladies, of her putting her makeup on, and she puts all of us who have full arms to shame. It's truly impressive. So you can see a lot of the great things that Zhu Li has done, but one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up her story is because her story has been so powerful that she has garnered a lot of attention, and media have covered the experiences that she's lived through. And so a lot of her interviews have been aired on TV and other places, and it just so happened that there was a young man who had also been going through a very difficult time. And he was so overwhelmed by his situation that, like Zhu Li, he was tempted to kill himself. Except, unlike Zhu Li, who was tempted and never acted upon it, he was literally on the verge of killing himself. He was in a room by himself with a gun in his hands, and he was about to blow his brains out. But before he had picked up the gun, he had turned the television on. And it just so happened that the station he had tuned into was airing an interview with Zhu Li. And so as that gun is in his hands and he's about to kill himself, he got distracted by this girl without full arms and without legs on TV and what she was sharing and the story of her life. And he put his gun down and he just sat in front of the TV and absorbed her testimony. And he was so moved by Zhu Li's story that instead of picking the gun up, he picked up a pen and paper and he wrote a letter to her, and they have since become friends. Now contrast the story of Zhu Li and that young man with the story of a man by the name of Will. Will, when he was in his mother's womb, already, in a sense, was an experience of trauma and injustice in that his mother was abandoned by his father while she was pregnant with Will. Then, when Will was 5 years old, being raised by a single mom, unfortunately, his mother was plagued with paranoid schizophrenia, and so she attempted to kill Will at the age of 5 with a butcher knife. She didn't succeed, thankfully, in killing Will, so she was sent off to an institution, and Will was sent to live with his brother. And Will lived with his brother until his brother committed suicide, leaving Will at the age of 9 on his own. Well, Will is like you and me. He is made for connection. He is made for relationship. And he needed community. But because he didn't have community in family, he sought community in a gang. Will got involved in a gang, and by the time he was in his late teens, he committed murder. Will is from this state, whereas you know, if you commit murder, it's possible you could be given the death penalty. And Will is no longer alive today because he was a recipient of capital punishment. Now, here's the reason why I wanted to tell you the story of Will in contrast to the story of Zhu Li and the young man. I believe their stories bring to light the next important principle that should guide our thinking, and the principle is the words of the great Martin Luther King Jr. And Dr. King once remarked, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." He said, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And we see that with the story of Zhu Li and the young man. Had she killed herself when she was 15, her story of overcoming suffering never would have been on TV, and therefore never would have impacted the guy who was about to kill himself, who didn't because he heard her story. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Will's mom was affected by Will's dad. Will was affected by his mom and his brother. He impacted other people by the choices that he made. No man is an island. And that's relevant when it comes to the topic of assisted suicide and euthanasia, because all too often people will say, it is just my life. If I have assisted suicide, if I want to kill myself, but I need a little help, so I ask you to assist me. If I end my life, it has no impact on you. It does not affect you because it affects me. But we know from the story of Will, and we know from the story of Zhu Li that that is not true. We are impacted by other people's choices. We are impacted by people's presence, as well as people's absence. Once we create a system, as has been the case in some states and is the case in my country of Canada and other parts of the world, once we create a system in which assisted suicide is legal, there will be people who will ask for it, not because deep down they want it, but because they're influenced by the choice of others. And they think, well, you know, my neighbor had assisted suicide because she didn't want to be a drain on her children. And here I am, an elderly person who feels like I'm a drain on my family. So maybe I should ask for assisted suicide too. And they might not mention their neighbor in their request, but they are nonetheless influenced by the choice someone else has made. Someone may feel that they can't truly trust their physician or their other healthcare practitioner and really express how they're feeling because they're afraid of how they may be responded to in a moment of weakness. Someone in great pain might be inclined to say, I want to die. And it's not because they truly want to be killed, but it's because they're in that much pain, they just want out of the pain. But in a system in which assisted suicide is made legal, suddenly that claim, I want to die, is now taken seriously, and a whole chain of events occur where someone's analyzed as to whether they're a candidate for assisted suicide or euthanasia. No man is an island. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. The next story that I wanted to share that again identifies a principle that should guide our thinking is the story of Zhu Li. So you may be able to tell by this photograph, Zhu is blind. Zhu is not blind because of some genetic condition. She's not blind by some accident. Zhu is blind by choice. Zhu has a condition called body integrity identity disorder. In short, it's referred to as BIID. People who have BIID desire a change in their physiology, in their body, but their body is healthy and it's their mind that is unhealthy. In Jewel's case, she could see, but she was convinced in her mind that she was supposed to be blind. She felt from the time she was a young age, she should not have been able to see, and she wanted to be blind. And so she claims when she was it was either her late teens or early 20s, that she managed to convince her counselor to put some Drano in an eyedropper and drop it into her eyes, which brought about her blindness. And she expresses how happy she is today to be blind. Most often, BIID, from the research I've done, seems to manifest itself not so much in a desire to be blind, but in a desire to be amputees. There are people with BIID who will go to their doctor, they have no presence of gangrene, let's say in their left leg, there is no infection, but they will beg their doctor to amputate their left limb, their left leg. Or they'll go to their doctor and say, I'm convinced I shouldn't have my right arm, please cut my right arm off. And again, there is no pathology present that would warrant an amputation, but the person desperately wants to become an amputee. Now, this is hard for most people to wrap their minds around because we think that is bizarre. Why would you want to be blind? Why would you want to become an amputee? But the point is this, from the story of Jewel or others with this condition, it brings to light the next principle I wanted to express, and that's this. We humans have all kinds of desires. Sometimes we have disordered desires. And just because we desire something, it doesn't mean that automatically we or others should follow through on that desire. Sure, Jewel and others with BIID have a desire, but because it's disordered, it should never have been acted upon, particularly in her case. So when it comes to assisted suicide and euthanasia, people will say, but it's my choice, it's my desire, I should be allowed to have this. But we realize from this story that not all desires are good. Not all desires are ordered. And in fact, if we can identify that the desire for an unnatural death, for a suicide with assistance is disordered, and hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll be well equipped to convince someone of that. If we can convince someone that it's disordered, then we should not follow through on it and act on it, just as the counselor should not have acted upon Jewel's desire for blindness. The next story I want to tell that identifies another principle that should guide our thinking, I'm going to let a video play out and then we'll go from there. So let's watch the following video.
The iconic beauty of the Golden Gate Bridge. On a clear day, picture postcard perfect. But on the day we met Kevin Berthia, gray skies shrouded by fog, perhaps befitting.
To actually get on the bridge for the first time, it was horrifying.
This is the first time Berthia says he's walked onto the bridge since his suicide attempt 10 years ago.
The wind, the noise, the traffic, the people. It brings me right back to that very moment where I nearly jumped.
Frightening, he says, but necessary.
The more and more I accept who I am, and know that wasn't me, it's just a part of who I am, but it's not who I am and it doesn't define me. It helps me move on.
On March 11, 2005, Berthia was the desperate 22-year-old captured in this photo. Battling depression for as long as he could remember, he said he had abandonment issues because he was adopted. And Berthia says he was grappling with being a new father of a premature baby, and he had just lost his job. He drove to the bridge, walked out, and climbed over the railing. Then he heard a voice.
I approached it very slowly and asked his permission for him to allow me to come up and speak with him.
Sergeant Kevin Briggs, whose job was to patrol the bridge for the Highway Patrol, said he didn't do much talking.
That's what a lot of people need, is just someone that will listen to them.
After an hour and a half of listening, the turning point came when the two spoke about Berthia's firstborn, a baby girl 1 month shy of her first birthday.
She kind of made me understand that I need to be here for her.
With the sergeant's help, Berthia climbed back over the rail, but his battle with depression was far from over.
It took me 8 years to just even confront that was me on the bridge.
And for 8 years, there was no contact between Berthia and Sergeant Briggs. But 2 years ago, the sergeant reached out to Berthia's mother to see how her son was doing. I asked the sergeant why he didn't contact them sooner.
If I contact them, maybe I could trigger something in them to go back to that day, and I don't want to do that.
But in May 2013, the two men were reunited in New York City for the first time since the suicide attempt. Berthia was invited to present the Lifesavers Award to Briggs, given by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It was then, Berthia said, that he finally confronted what happened that day on the bridge, when he saw the photos of himself on the bridge through the eyes of the audience.
I wanted to hide it. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to, and the more and more I talk about it, it has helped me, and the more and more I talk about it, it's helped people.
Now, the father of three, Berthia recently found a new job and hopes to marry his fiancée. Once lost, now a newfound sense of peace and happiness.
I just focus on going this way. I don't worry about going back. I don't worry about left, I don't worry about right, I just worry about forward. Monday, I got the job and the car went out Monday. All we can do is laugh.
Now able to laugh at life's obstacles instead of despair. Bound by fate, the two men say they talk to each other often.
We are going to stay friends forever. We're brothers, so to speak.
They plan to appear together to speak publicly about suicide prevention.
Biggest, hardest thing I had to do was take the step. And that's the hardest thing anybody has to do, is take that first step.
A step forward in the never-ending journey of self-discovery and acceptance. Amber Lee, KTVU, Fox 2 News.
The principle I believe that story brings to light, I present to you in the form of a question. And it's a question that my former colleague Jonathan Van Maren and my friend Blaise Elaine present in their book on assisted suicide, an excellent apologetic that I highly recommend. And the question is this: who gets suicide assistance and who gets suicide prevention? Who gets suicide assistance and who gets suicide prevention? In other words, if someone is standing on the edge of a bridge the way Kevin Berthia was, and you come upon them the way Sergeant Briggs did, how do you decide whether you push them off or pull them back? How do you decide? All too often our culture will say choice. If the person wants the suicide, we assist them. And if they don't want it, then it would never be appropriate to assist them. But let's consider that for a moment. Most people who support assisted suicide, I would suggest, most if not all would agree that Sergeant Briggs did the right thing by essentially pulling Kevin back, by engaging him in a conversation to draw him over that railing onto the safety side. They would say he did the right thing, even though Kevin Berthia thought he wanted the suicide. Well, let's change the scenario. We could present to someone who supports assisted suicide. Imagine it's not Kevin Berthia that wants to end his life, a young man in his early 20s, with a girlfriend, a new baby. Let's imagine that it's someone who's 80. And this old woman has had cancer, and she's had multiple rounds of chemo, and it's not working anymore, and the cancer has taken over her body, and she's been told you only have 6 months left to live. And she thinks, look, if I'm going to die in 6 months, I may as well die in 3. And she wants assisted suicide. Would you support that? And the supporter of assisted suicide will say, yes, sure, of course. If it's truly about choice, the person claiming that they want assisted suicide is the reason why we support it. If it's truly about choice, then we should support the assisted suicide of Kevin Berthia as well as that 80-year-old woman. But if someone would push the 80-year-old woman off, figuratively speaking, but pull back Kevin Berthia, then what that shows is that it's not really about choice, because both people want to choose death. If we pull one back, it's actually about judgment. My judgment about that person. Your life is worth saving. Yeah, your life isn't. So the other side will claim it's about choice, but the moment some people get suicide prevention and other people get suicide assistance, we smoke them out and prove it's not about choice, it's about judgment. You're judging that's a life worth saving, and you're judging that that's not a life worth saving. And if we believe all humans are equal, then rather some getting suicide assistance and others getting suicide prevention, everyone should be getting suicide prevention. Isn't it interesting that when it comes to suicide by itself, if you're going to kill yourself without any assistance, our culture presents that as a tragedy, as something to mourn and as something to be prevented. But the moment we throw the word assisted in front of the suicide, suddenly people think it's okay. And so rather than people saying it's about choice, we want to ask the question, who gets suicide assistance, who gets suicide prevention, in order to show it's about judgment, not about choice. Having said all of that, the second thing I want to do this morning is move to us reflecting on how the other side thinks. What are the reasons people give for why assisted suicide is acceptable? And what are the responses that we as pro-lifers can provide as an alternative to assisted suicide in light of the reasons that are concerning and understandable? So of all the reasons people give in support of assisted suicide, there's 5 in particular that I think in my research are the most common that come to people's minds that I want to address today. So the first reason is pain, particularly physical pain. And whenever we hear something in dialogue, those of you who have heard me speak on abortion will know that I talk about the power of stories, the power of questions, and the power of finding common ground. What can I agree with the person I'm dialoguing on? What's legitimate in what they've said? And so I've already talked about stories. I've just presented a question. I want to talk about, for a moment, common ground. When someone gives a reason for assisted suicide, such as physical pain, there's something we can agree with them on. And what we can agree with them on is this: physical pain is a problem. When someone is in agony, when someone is suffering, that's a crisis. And we should work to alleviate their suffering. We should address that problem. Once we find common ground, I agree with you, that's a crisis. We then ask them a question. And the question we ask is this: is it possible to alleviate someone's physical pain without eliminating them, the person? Is it possible to alleviate someone's physical pain without eliminating them, the person? And so as the pro-lifers, we want to respond with pain management. That ought to be our response. And the reality is we have advanced greatly every year, let alone, let's say, 100 years ago, in our ability to manage people's pain. And the vast majority of pain can be controlled. But having said that, we have to be intellectually honest and acknowledge that there is some physical pain that cannot be entirely eliminated. My dad, my cousin, they live with chronic pain. There are people with conditions in which, although they can take some pain meds, they're still going to be uncomfortable. But nonetheless, we want to throw people the question, is it possible to alleviate, not eliminate, is it possible to alleviate the suffering without eliminating the sufferer? And I think it is, and I'm going to give a story to demonstrate that. I want to tell you about an excruciatingly painful condition called epidermolysis bullosa. How many of you have heard of this condition? In short, it's called EB. Just a couple of hands have gone up. This is a picture of a young boy, Jonathan Pietra, from Canada, who died almost a year ago, spring 2018. And Jonathan lived his whole life with epidermolysis bullosa. Children with EB are often called butterfly children because their skin is as fragile as a butterfly's wings. Any pressure, any force results in massive blisters that usually cover the entirety of the person's body, and these individuals live in excruciating pain. Not only is epidermolysis external, but it can be internal, which means the consumption of food and the friction of food moving down the throat is painful for these people because they have blisters in their throat as well. And so they're often tube fed in order to receive nourishment without that reception of nourishment being agonizing. And so this is a condition where, when talking about pain, if anyone's going to live in pain, it's someone with epidermolysis bullosa. And yet I believe the story of Jonathan demonstrates that we can alleviate suffering without eliminating the sufferer. And so I want to play for you a video clip of an interview that was done a few years prior to Jonathan passing away. So let's take a look.
Where do you get the strength to get up every morning knowing what you're going to have to go through?
That strength comes from the people around me, because they do believe in me that I can get through it.
For years, Jonathan believed he was the only one going through the pain. Until 2012, when he was invited to an EB conference in Toronto. It was a conference that changed his life.
I had never met anyone with my condition. I had never, had any explanation. I had never known there was anyone else.
How did you feel when you saw the other kids that had it?
I knew that I wasn't alone anymore. I knew since then that I was going to become, an ambassador. I wanted to start helping other people with EB.
In October of 2014, Jonathan put his story out to the world. With the help of the Ottawa Citizen, Jonathan courageously revealed his wounds to the masses. The article went viral throughout Ottawa and landed on a special team's doorstep.
I read it, and it was so moving that I brought the article in, and we talked about what we could do to help in any way we could.
November 20th, 2014. The Ottawa Senators invite Jonathan to a game and make him a scout for the day. He signs a pro contract from GM Brian Murray and takes questions from the media.
Is there any one particular area of the Senators you're going to be focusing in on tonight, or is it the whole team that you're going to watch?
A team isn't just made of one player, it's all of them, so I'll be watching the whole team.
The Ottawa Senators are proud to welcome their newest professional scout to the organization, Jonathan Pietra. Jonathan, welcome to the organization. Enjoy the game.
Since his day with the Senators, Jonathan has helped raise over $100,000 for EB awareness. There is no cure for epidermolysis bullosa. Most butterfly children don't make it to the age of 30. It's a reality 14-year-old Jonathan deals with head on.
Have you thought a lot about the future?
Definitely. EB's a cruel thing. And yes, I've thought about it for sure. Like, how can't you? You know it's a reality. But I think I just pushed that aside. I'm here, and I'm gonna go step by step, day by day, and you never know what the future holds. I may live to 100. We can't know. But I'm not gonna stop anytime soon. I'm gonna keep going.
EB is a cruel thing. But how is killing the person with it a solution to the problem? In fact, if we eliminate all people with EB, what motivation do we have to come up with a cure? If we eliminate all people who are in excruciating pain, what motivation do we have to come up with better pain meds? Having watched this clip many times, what has struck me is the theme of team. He's asked, what motivates you to get up every day? And he talks about the people around me. When he was asked about the hockey team, which player he'd be watching, he's like, I'm going to watch all of them. And when he talked about what motivated him to become an ambassador for EB awareness, interestingly, it was not his own suffering. It was not his lived experience of EB. It was what? Who picked up on it? Where did he go? Who did he meet? He went to a conference. He met other kids with EB. He realized he wasn't alone. Again, he was part of a team. And in knowing that through his own experience of suffering, that there were other people suffering like him, that's what motivated him to become an ambassador for EB awareness, to share his story, to raise $100,000. And I would like to point out that although I mentioned Jonathan passed away a year ago, he died fighting to live. The whole reason he passed away was because he and his mom had traveled from Canada to Minnesota, where they were having experimental stem cell research done, where stem cells were being taken from his mom's body and injected into his body to try to get his skin to grow better. And the good news is it was working. But unfortunately, there was a complication with the procedure that resulted in an infection in his body, and he succumbed to the infection. But he died trying to live. And so I would suggest when someone says pain is a reason for assisted suicide, we acknowledge that that's a problem, we agree on that, but our solution ought to be pain management. Not only the development of better pain meds, but looking for ways that we can alleviate the person's suffering without eliminating the person. And that means being a part of a team, helping them know that they are connected, that they are in relationship, that they can find meaning in their suffering. Another common reason people give associated to the first reason is emotional pain. And again, we can agree on something. That's a problem. If someone is in such turmoil in their heart, in their mind, emotionally, psychologically, we need to respond to that. But rather than respond with assisted suicide, why not counseling? Why not address the underlying problem? And let me give you an example. I was reading a story of a palliative care physician who was talking about a patient of his by the name of Alice. Alice had end-stage lung cancer, and understandably, she was in pain, great physical pain. What was not comprehensible to this doctor is why he could not manage her physical pain. And he talked about how he had had many patients with the same type of cancer who near death, while they were in pain, he could always manage their pain, give them a right concoction of pain meds in which that could be alleviated. But Alice was different. Nothing was working. And he said she would lay in that bed and she would writhe in pain and she would scream out in pain. The nurses and other doctors would come out of this room and out of her room and say to this head doctor, like, you've got to do something. What can you do to help her? And he was kind of at his wit's end thinking, I don't know. All my other patients, I could manage their pain. And so he walked into the room and got an idea. He sat on the edge of her bed and he put his hand on her arm. And he looked at her and he said, Alice, I'm wondering if I can't fix the pain in your chest because, Alice, I'm wondering if it's a pain I can't touch. Is it possible, Alice, that the pain is in your heart? And this look washed over her face of being understood. And she opened up and she said, Doctor, I have one daughter. And my daughter's in a relationship with a man I think is bad news. I think if she marries him, her future will be utter misery. And because I'm dying, and I don't have much time left on this earth, and I certainly won't be around to help my daughter, I thought I need to confront her. I need to tell her what I think. I need to warn her. Unfortunately, she did not receive well my warning, and when I told her what I thought, she has disowned me. And in that moment, the doctor realized the reason they couldn't fix her physical pain was because the physical pain wasn't the problem. This woman was in emotional turmoil, and in a psychosomatic way, it was manifesting as a physical pain, but deep down, the problem was emotional. And when we care about people, then we dig deep enough to identify the root problem and then address it. In a documentary I watched of an elderly gentleman who wanted assisted suicide, they played out in this documentary what his life had been like and where he'd come from. And what came up was that as a young child, he was abandoned by his parents and put in the foster care system. When he grew up, he got married, had a child, then he divorced his wife to get into a homosexual relationship. Now, decades later, he wanted assisted suicide. And as I thought about all of that, I thought this man, from the time he was a child, has a history of fractured, broken relationships. And assisted suicide's not going to solve that. And so it brings to mind a song, an old song, again, I'm going to be dating myself here, an old song by Tim McGraw. Some of you may know it because they were playing old music earlier and you guys seem to know it. But Tim McGraw has that song about a man in his early 40s who gets a terminal diagnosis and decides to do a bunch of things. He went what? I went skydiving, I went Rocky Mountain climbing, I did 2.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu. But then he sings, I loved deeper, I spoke sweeter, and I gave forgiveness I'd been denying. And says, I hope you get the chance to live like you were dying. And I think that needs to be our response when someone's in emotional pain. Acknowledge that's a problem, but then think, how can we help such individuals love deeper, speak sweeter, and give forgiveness they'd been denying, or receive forgiveness that they'd been denied? Another reason people often give for assisted suicide is burden, that they feel like they are a burden on someone. Again, we agree that's a problem. That's a problem if someone feels like they're a burden. Rather than respond to that with assisted suicide, we need to help people see perspective. And perspective is all about looking at the same situation in a different way. Dan and Matt are an illustration of that. The same situation of paralysis, Dan looked in a negative way, Matt looked at a positive way. So when someone feels like a burden, how do we help them see the same thing differently? To give you a lighthearted example of perspective, how many of you have heard of or played my favorite board game, Telestrations? Anyone? A few people. For those of you who haven't, I'm going to put up a slide that shows how the game works. Now, there's going to be a lot that comes on the screen, so follow my fancy little pointer, which I'll use on this screen. So the way the game works is like this. You get a little card. Oh yeah, there's my pointer. And on the card is something like doggy bag, which you write on a notepad. Then you flip your notepad over and you draw what you just wrote. Then you hand your notepad to the next person who doesn't see what you wrote, they only see what you drew, and they have to guess. So they correctly guess doggy bag. To the next person, they pass the notepad who only sees the words doggy bag and has to draw it. So this person draws it, passes their picture to the next person who guesses purse snatcher. The next individual draws a purse snatcher, which is perceived as a man purse, and then it's kind of like telephone. Another example, someone got wallflower, so they drew a wall with a flower. But the next individual perceived that as a man in a wall, which was drawn well as a man in a wall, but not so well because someone thought that's Han Solo. Now, I thought this artist here is fantastic, but not so great because although I think that looks like Han Solo, this person thought it was a gangster. And so the next individual drew a gangster. Now, I know what's going to happen. I should be getting a kickback from all the Telestrations board game purchases, but you're all going to go buy this game now, aren't you? Anyways, the point is that you can see the same thing differently. And so when someone feels like they're a burden, we want to help them see the situation differently. You're right, there is a burden here, but the burden's not you. The burden's your illness, or the burden's your disability, or the burden's your age. And because I love you, I want to carry the burden with you. I want to lighten the load. I think of an example of a woman, again, a documentary I watched. She wanted assisted suicide. Her story came out. She was newly divorced. Her ex-husband was no longer in her life. She had one child, a daughter, in 12th grade, and had planned to go off to college, but because her mom was sick and didn't have support, she decided that she would stay home and care for her mom. And the mom felt like a burden and wanted assisted suicide. And I thought to myself, this daughter will learn more in the school of love, caring for her mom, than she ever will at a post-secondary institution. I'm reminded of the words of the great late Saint John Paul II. In Salvifici Dolores, on the Christian meaning of human suffering, he said the following: we could say suffering is present in order to unleash love in the human person. Suffering is present to unleash love. If you think about it, when do we step outside of ourselves and help someone in need, help someone who's weak and someone who's vulnerable? It's when they need. It's when they're in crisis. And their neediness unleashes our love. And so when someone feels like a burden, but in reality we know it's the disease that's the burden, that ought to unleash our love, not our assistance with their death. Another reason people give for assisted suicide is they feel like they are useless. So it's not just that I'm a burden on you, but I can't do anything. And again, we acknowledge it's a problem if someone feels their life is not worth living because they can't do anything or much. The solution, rather than assisted suicide, ought to be helping them see their self-worth. That at the end of the day, our value actually isn't in our usefulness. It's in who we are. That's why one of my favorite ads is that of the Canadian Down Syndrome Society. Several years ago, they had this billboard in various cities, and I love the caption that we are to celebrate being. Because first and foremost, we are human beings, and we are human beings that can do, but even if we can't do, If we are, then we ought to be celebrated. I want to play for you a video of an amazing program in Washington State that brings two groups of people that by the world's standards are kind of useless. The very old and the very young. Two groups of people that can't do much, and yet when you see them come together and simply be, when you see them connect and enter into relationship, we come to see that our worth should be grounded in our existence and connection with another rather than in how useful we are. So let's take a look.
What do you see?
A brown bear.
A brown bear. Does everybody
Mary
see a
McGovern
brown
is
bear?
95 years old, and one of her favorite things to do is to read to toddlers.
And what is that? A bird?
A bird.
A bird. What color is the bird?
Red.
Red. Everybody knows that.
Luckily for Mary, she doesn't need to go any further than down the hall to find her young friends.
Oh, see, look in here as the little kids. See that?
Oh, yeah. McGovern lives at Providence Mount St. Vincent, a nursing home in Seattle, Washington that also houses a daycare for children up to 5 years of age.
Can you hand out a scarf? Thank you, honey. Thank you. There you go.
Oh, thank you very much.
Butterfly.
Every weekday, 500 residents are joined by 125 children in the facility affectionately called the Mount.
Peekaboo.
Peekaboo.
I see you.
Administrator Charlene Boyd.
We wanted to create a place for people to come to live and not to come to die.
So in 1991, Boyd and other administrators added a high-quality preschool to the nursing home and created an intergenerational learning center, a community for the very old and very young.
Why is there this railing here? This railing is here not for the kids, but it's here for residents. And it's a safety piece for a resident in a wheelchair to push themselves up and to hold on and to bring themselves to a standing position and watch the children through the window.
So they can stand here and look in.
They can stand here and look in. It's putting high-quality childcare in a setting that links old and young together.
Say, have a nice day.
Making the magic between these two ages together, bringing joy to the residents and joy to those young children. It's just like this magical formula that happens every day.
Get a high five. There, she knows how to do a high five. Most of them, they're curious about me, why you're here. I tell them I'm here because when I was living in my house, when I got too old, I wasn't always walking straight and sometimes I would fall. And if I fell, I had to have some help to get up because I couldn't get off the floor. I want to hug your baby doll.
I think there are things that both parties take away from the interaction. It's not like a lifelong relationship, but just for that moment in time, they're both enjoying each other's company and getting something out of their relationship with that person in that moment.
Another one, give me a hug. Come on, good hug.
All of us have common needs to be recognized. All of us have common need to be loved, and all of us have common needs to share life together. And so these children bring life and vibrancy and normalcy. It's a gift. It's a gift in exposing young families to the positive aspects of aging, and it's a gift of also having children seeing frailty, normalcy, and that's part of that full circle of life.
He rocks his treetops all day long, hopping and a bopping and singing his song.
Intergenerational activities can be spontaneous or planned, like this sing-along.
There's 36 visits possible each week. So each classroom, 6 classrooms, has at least 3 visits, up to 6 visits.
In my heart.
The director of the center, Marie Hoover, says children become comfortable with elderly residents at an early age.
Whether they're in a wheelchair or in a walker, or maybe they're hard to understand, or you have to speak louder, it is just about who that individual is, and they adjust. The kids just don't, they really don't blink an eye. This is normal. This is just who this resident is.
93-year-old Harriet Thompson joined this sing-along on her way to the dining hall.
I usually like to go sit down for a while before dinner, but I heard them singing, so in we went.
What do you experience internally when you're around these children?
Happiness. Just plain old happiness. You know, yeah. It beats anything else. It beats television.
Boredom and loneliness are sort of the plagues of older adults.
There she goes. Yep.
There's nothing more delightful than seeing young children with noise, with laughter.
You see the residents and then hear the sound of the kids coming down the hall, and it's as though sunlight just came through the window.
One documentary I watched of two men who traveled to Europe for euthanasia, one of the men had been a university professor and could no longer teach. The other had been a surgeon and could no longer do surgery. And I thought to myself, you know, the problem with those amazing professions is that because you accomplish so much and you do so much, that your whole identity gets wrapped up in that. So that when the professor can't teach and the surgeon can't do surgery, you think you ought not be. And to those men, what needed to be said was something that one of the workers at the center in that documentary said, which is that we all have common needs: to be recognized, to be loved, and to have someone to share life with. A professor doesn't need to teach. A surgeon doesn't need to do surgery as much as they want to. But they do have legitimate needs: to be loved, recognized, and have someone to share life with. And that ought to be how we respond when someone feels useless, is helping address their underlying needs for love and connection. The final reason I want to address for assisted suicide is that some people fear a bad death. And again, we acknowledge that's a problem. Rather than orchestrating a death down to the day, hour, minute, and second, why not palliative care? Where people are in beautiful environments that are aesthetically pleasing, where the whole of their person is helped, not just physical pain being managed, but connection with others, entering into the present moment, finding experiences of beauty, having someone hold your hand, listening to music. How do we help people enter into the experience of the final time of their time on this earth and let their death come about naturally? I want to tell you about a palliative care physician by the name of Dr. B.J. Miller, who didn't always plan to become a doctor. He had studied years before going to med school. He was doing his undergraduate at Princeton University. And at Princeton, there's this rail car on campus. And it was about, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning one night where he and friends were horsing around on campus. Obviously, the rail car was not functioning at that time of night. And Bruce said to his friends, hey, let's climb up the rail car. And so here these guys are in their undergrad thinking, oh, this will be fun. And so they climb up the rail car, and Bruce gets to the top first, and he put his arm up. And there were these cables hanging down. And he had a gold watch on. And 11,000 volts arced from those cables into his arm and exited out his 2 feet. He almost died. He spent months on a burn unit. And ultimately, that arm and 2 legs had to be amputated. That experience set him on a journey in which he eventually became a palliative care doctor. And through his experience, Dr. Miller talks about how even when you're in pain, you can enter into the present moment and find beauty, awe, and wonder, which we should help people do when they're in palliative care. And he cites an example of how the room he was in had no windows, and one night, it was wintertime, nurses coming into their shifts late were complaining about a big snowstorm outside that ruined their commute. But the moment he heard them say snowstorm, even though he had no ability to see it, he imagined it. And he talks about how just laying in bed, thinking about the beauty of snow, the white fluff falling to the ground at night, creating this untouched blanket as lights gleam upon it, was a moment of joy for him. And then he says the next day, one of the nurses came in and smuggled him a snowball and placed it on his skin. And he said, I can't tell you how amazing it was, the rapture I felt just staring at that snowball, watching it melt and disappear before my eyes. How do we help people enter into the present moment and still find awe and wonder in their experience on this earth, even when it's near the end. The last video clip I want to play for you is a portion of Dr. Miller's TED Talk. So let's take a look.
We need to lift our sights, to set our sights on well-being. So that life can become, and health care can become about making life more wonderful rather than just less horrible. Beneficence. Here, this gets right at the distinction between a disease-centered and a patient or human-centered model of care. And here is where caring becomes a creative, generative, even playful act. Play may sound like a funny word here, but it's also one of our highest forms of adaptation. Consider every major compulsory effort it takes to be human. The need for food is birth cuisine. The need for shelter has given rise to architecture. The need for cover, fashion, and for being subjected to the clock, well, we invented music. So, since dying is a necessary part of life, what might we create with this fact? By play, I am in no way suggesting that we take a light approach to dying or that we mandate any particular way of dying. There are mountains of sorrow that cannot move, and one way or another, we will all kneel there. Rather, I am asking we make space, physical, psychic room, to allow life to play itself all the way out, so that rather than just getting out of the way, aging and dying can become a process of crescendo through to the end. We can't solve for death. I know some of you are working on this. Meanwhile, we can design towards it. Now, parts of me died early on, and that's something we can all say one way or another. I got to redesign my life around this fact, and I tell you, it has been a liberation to realize you can always find a shock of beauty or meaning in what life you have left. Like that snowball lasting for a perfect moment, all the while melting away. If we love such moments ferociously, then maybe we can learn to live well, not in spite of death, but because of it. Let death be what takes us, not lack of imagination.
Let death be what takes us, not a lack of imagination. And if we go back to all the reasons people have for assisted suicide, if we look at those reasons and end with assisted suicide, I would say that's not being creative. That's a lack of imagination. Instead, in light of these reasons, how do we get better at pain management? How do we help people repair broken relationships? How do we help them find their self-worth? How do we develop better palliative care programs? And so I would say assisted suicide and euthanasia ought to be rejected because when you choose that path, death doesn't take you. You take death. When you choose assisted suicide, death doesn't take you. You take death. And we know that's fundamentally disordered. We know that's disordered when we think of Jewel. We know that's disordered when we think of Kevin Berthea about to jump and how everyone knows we should pull him back. We think of the connectedness of the human person, like through the stories of Will or Zhu Li. And we think of Dan versus Matt and how in suffering, we can avoid despair if we find meaning. So let death be what takes us, not a lack of imagination. And so I would suggest what we need to suggest is to the culture is that we start using our imagination more and we get more creative. And so the final word I want to leave you with is the practical takeaway. I often say that where assisted suicide become legal, are legal, or may become legal in the future, if such laws are followed, it should never happen unless someone asks for it, which means the job of you and me is to make sure no one asks for it. On a very practical level, we ought to prioritize spending time with the sick, the disabled, and the lonely or elderly so that they're never in a situation in which they're asking someone to assist them with their suicide. And so I want to encourage you as you go forward later today and go home for you to think about how you can carve time out of your weekly schedule to spend time with someone who's lonely. That might be a family member. You might not have to go farther than that. It might be contacting your priest or pastor and saying, is there someone in our church who's a shut-in who needs a visitor? Or it might mean going to a hospital and volunteering as a visitor. But whatever it is, I implore you to think about how you can invest time in order to celebrate being and help those who are suffering find meaning so that they don't despair. And so I'd like to leave you with the words of Matt, the young man who opted not to have assisted suicide the way Dan Hampson did. And Matt says, my life is good now, and in some aspects better than it was in 2005. I feel like a more rounded person. I look towards the future rather than the past. And so my hope is that you can help others do the same. Thank you very much.